Hey there, listener. Corey Andrew Powell here, and I'm excited to share that Motivational Mondays is now sponsored by BetterHelp. Feeling stressed or anxious? Well, BetterHelp brings you online therapy that's convenient and affordable. NSLS members get 50% off your first month of BetterHelp when you sign up at betterhelp.com/NSLS or click the link in the show notes. Start your journey to better mental health today. Hello, everyone. I am Corey Andrew Powell, and welcome to another episode of Motivational Mondays presented by the NSLS, where we are now impacting over 2 million members nationwide. Now, today we're also excited to be joined by Nikki Holmes, also known as N.L. Holmes, a prolific novelist with 13 published books, including the Lord Hanny Mysteries and the Empire at Twilight series. And she's had a fascinating life overall. Before becoming a writer, she spent 2 decades as a nun, then pursued careers in archaeology and education. Nikki's also lived in places as diverse as Greece and Israel and northern France, and her background in ancient history greatly influences her storytelling. Nikki, welcome to Motivational Mondays.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
It's my pleasure. And I do want to clarify, because you do go by NL as an author. May I refer to you as Nikki, or do you prefer NL?
Please. Yeah, that's my name.
Okay, wonderful. Well, first, also a really quick shout out to Northern France. I love Northern France as well. Everyone goes to Paris, but
we're about 55 minutes by high-speed train. So not too
wonderful.
far.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah, my first time in Europe was actually Paris, and I thought it was great. But then when I went to Saint-Malo and Saint-Michel, I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. So anyway, I share that love of that territory with you. So let's begin with your interesting career. As I said before we started recording, actually, to me, your life almost seems like a novel. It's like it's like got all the elements there, So I just love to just start with the beginning with your career shifts, if you will. So can you share what led you to leave the convent after 2 decades to then pursue archaeology?
Well, it's a little hard to describe, but it had been a difficult time, and then I sort of perceived that I was no longer in the place where I should be, that it had served its purpose for me, and I had served my purpose for the community and for the church. So there was something else waiting for me. And I went through all the official channels, waited, months and over a year, and got an official dispensation and everything legal.
Wow. I didn't realize that there is I guess many people don't realize that there is a process.
Right. It's a legal process because you've changed state. It's like a divorce in the sense that your status changes when you leave.
Wow.
And then there's a kind of a probationary period once you've left too, just to be sure you're serious about it.
Okay. And that period would allow you then basically to say, hey, I have changed my mind, or.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Well, it's fascinating too, thinking about the trajectory. Well, let me just first say, when it comes to, we're a leadership podcast, and one component I don't want to skip over is what you just said, the admission of knowing when something for you feels like it's served it's run its course, or it's served its purpose, and having that honest conversation with yourself about, am I happy? What's next for me? That's a really important component.
Yeah, and as you say, this is about leadership. So what kind of precipitated my departure was the fact that I could see for the latest vote for the prioress, every few years we had an election to choose the leader of the community. And I could see that I was going to get elected soon. It was moving in that direction. So I didn't feel that would have been an honest choice on my part to accept leadership when I was already, taking off in my mind. So that had to be considered, to be honest, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, that's another great point, because you can't lead anyone with clarity if you are yourself in some sort of conflict of, where you're supposed to be. So another great point. And now I also think on some hands, what's interesting is some people may think, wow, from nun to archaeologist to novelist. But when you look at, I guess, the origin, of course, of the Bible, let's just say, and all the sort of ancient biblical books or religious books, it seems to me really logical that
Good.
someone
I felt like it was too.
yeah, I mean, from all the learnings and teachings that go with the Bible, I mean, it's this ancient mystery filled book that's somewhat cryptic and has all the entities and the spirits, and it's got all the things that are sort of just really just almost seemingly like they are themselves in conflict. People argue fictitious. I mean, that's always one of the big arguments people make about religious books. But the components are there for the interest you would take on in art.
Absolutely, it's and actually biblical archaeology. It was part of my focus. It was Greece and the Near East, the Levant. So I excavated in Israel and everything, and that was very much in my mind. And it was actually real historical events that sparked my interest in writing fiction because, as you say, the elements are all there, the drama and the bigger than life characters, and just, a historiographer can't take it beyond the few little clues that we have, but but a novelist can.
Well, exactly. And it's almost like if I look at that sort of that golden age in Hollywood where it was basically the biblical films that were brought to the big screen, and and they brought them epically, from the Red Sea splitting to everything, Samson, Delilah, and the hair growing back. And I mean, those books, those stories are just so rich with all those textures. So for me, I just also figured there's a sort of a disconnect, though. I'm wondering, how did it go from being the archaeological presence to then saying, I want to write about this stuff, and then make your own sort of variations of those stories, if you will?
Well, when I was teaching, for one thing, I taught a class in ancient Egypt, so that was lurking in the back of my mind. But what really sort of pushed me over was I had a course called Ancient Near Eastern Empires. And in it, we discussed the Hittite Empire and their vassal states in Syria, one of which was the city-state of Ugarit, which is now in modern Syria. And there were a few documents there that found that had talked about a certain royal divorce in the 13th century BC. And we had just a few little snippets, one from the king himself and one from the brother of the wife, and they just, each one told a little piece of a story, but not filling in anything. And so, just as an exercise in reading ancient documents, I gave these things to my students and said, reconstruct what happened. And it was fascinating what they came up with. But, it was quite clear that almost anything you could say that was a coherent account was as much fiction as historiography. So I thought to myself, when I retire, I'm going to turn this into a novel. And that's how my first story got going.
Wow. Yeah. And that's also great too, because it's another trajectory for you. People think, well, what am I going to do now in retirement? You're like, no, I have a whole other thing I'm going to do in retirement.
There was no problem thinking of things to do in my retirement.
Yeah, I can imagine, because you had done so much. You're like, this is my time now. I'm going to figure this out. So, and that's what you would say sparked that whole sort of experience. Is that what sparked your interest in the ancient civilizations as sort of like the crux of a lot of the stuff you write about?
Yes, my earliest series was taking a historical figure from the Hittite Empire and kind of taking each generation in which he figured, so his childhood, but taken from the point of view of another character, a fictional character. Well, he wasn't fictional, but a minor character. And then talking more about the person, the king himself, and then on another one of his children, and then somewhere else, something that happened in a vassal state 500 miles away, but during his reign, and just so they're not really a coherent story, but they're linked by the time and place, a kind of a joined world. The other stories have been more directly sparked by an arc, a historical arc, and that was the Lord Hani series, which you mentioned, because Hani himself was a real life character. He was a diplomat whose name occurs in a number of references in what we call the Amarna letters. That's a set of ancient correspondence, diplomatic correspondence that were found that cover the reigns of Akhenaten and his father,
Mm-hmm.
Hotep III.
Mm-hmm.
So, I took each little mention of Hani and tried to work them into a set of stories, so different adventures, you might say, of this diplomat, this real life diplomat.
Hmm. So I was wondering too, if you think like there is a correlation between what you're writing and what you're you're in essence, you're filling in the gap, so to speak,
Right.
creatively for these
Yeah.
stories where there's holes in them. And so how much are you drawing from actual fantasy or versus the references for how things are today, politically, socially, like
Oh,
those constructs? Are you sort of
good question.
weaving those in?
Yeah, I'm not deliberately, but you can't avoid the parallels. Let's put it that
Mm-hmm.
way.
Right.
Well, when I was writing my book about Syrian refugees, it was the moment when there were Syrian refugees pouring out of the country after the fall of Assad there, and I was writing about a plague in Egypt, and there was COVID happening in our own country, and
Mm.
the Lord Hani series deal largely with the agonies of conscience of a man employed by a corrupt government, and how he had to deal with the split loyalty between his conscience on the one hand, his religious values, and on the other hand, his loyalty to the king and his oath to serve the country. So I guess you just can't get away from the modern politics, and
Yeah.
it repeats itself over and over.
Yeah, that's a great point too. It's not like it's unlikely to have happened
No,
originally.
no, it isn't.
Yeah, we're just like on the fifth repeat of all of the same things.
Just different costumes. That's all.
Yeah, apparently we just haven't learned our lesson. Sometimes
No,
throughout history we try, but I'm not sure if it always works. Now,
no.
I know for my own personal experience when it comes to the idea of being an archaeologist, when I was like about 10 or 11 years old and my family first got cable TV and I, snuck up one night watching something I was supposed to be asleep, not watching. And there was a film called Summer Lovers about these kids who go to Greece and they meet an archaeologist.
Wow.
And I was fascinated. The film was a little provocative, but I was fascinated by the archaeology story. I was always watching the digs and the beautiful scenery because they would be all in different parts of Greece. And I had never seen anything like that from Trenton, New Jersey. So I think it's for me, oddly enough, it sparked an interest in like, I want to see the world. So you got to do that, obviously. And you also recovered artifacts. Like you've actually found actual things.
Yeah. And everyone asked what was the most interesting or exciting thing you found. And
Yeah.
it's a kind of a humble thing, really, but I found it very moving. When I was excavating on the island of Crete, it was a Minoan town, a port town, and we found a large pot that was broken into 250 some odd pieces. And when we put it back together, you could see that there were handprints all over it. Someone's stubby little hand had made black prints all over this pot. And you could actually see the fingerprints on it. And it was just so personal. You knew it could only have been one person in the history of the universe who could have made those prints.
Yeah.
And it was as if they were reaching up out of the past to say, remember me. It was just, it was better for me than all the architectural wonders or the, whatever gold or somehow.
Yeah, right. I know. Yeah, because people would think something big and grandiose. You found the silver chalice of
this personal thing.
Yeah.
This person, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is fascinating because you do get to see that. I think that's that correlation between realizing that although we sort of distance ourselves from these things in museums and archaeological digs, but we forget that that's an actual representation of real folks who walked the planet before we got here.
Yeah.
And in your Empire at Twilight series, and so that's a bit of a different approach, but also it has historical accuracy, right, and creative storytelling. So I just wonder, like, what is another realm, I guess, of that genre that you might want to explore? Or is it just basically always sort of, your books are going to be pretty much in this ancient civilization place?
Well, I've considered maybe someday writing a fantasy, because the idea of world building is so similar to historical fiction.
Mm-hmm.
But I haven't yet done that really.
Yeah.
I figure that anyone who can write a book, a modern book, but only someone with, some interest or knowledge of the past can do a convincing job of writing a historical fiction. So for the time being, I guess I'm satisfied where I am. I may
Yeah.
change civilizations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, they say stick with what works. So as well as that's
Yeah.
working, seems
Well,
like it's doing pretty good.
not everybody is interested in the deep past, the Bronze Age where I live, but they are interested in Egypt by and large. So I thought that would be a good place to settle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that does seem like that's never waned, like Egypt as an interest, for
Yeah,
all humanity. And I guess it's just because of how it's positioned as far as like being really the cradle of civilization, or Africa, the whole continent in general. But
yeah,
I think that's always going to be a rich area where fiction and truth can sort of like coexist. And there's a whole lot of great content
yeah, yeah.
that can be
And
made.
it is a wonderful, rich, and amazingly advanced civilization for its time.
Hmm. I know we see a lot of those documentaries about how they build those pyramids, and and there's no definitive answer, but we do know
No,
that it would seemingly be impossible with that level of accuracy. And so I don't know. Do you subscribe to any theories like aliens
um,
helped?
no, I don't think we need to go that far afield. I think humans are perfectly capable of doing amazing things.
Mm,
If it's coordination and mobilization of vast labor forces
right.
and just patience and skill. And they made beautiful jewelry too, but I haven't heard anyone say that it must have been extraterrestrials who made their jewelry.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I know. It's always. I had a really good friend he's an Egyptian kid named Nader, and he was so annoyed at this idea that Egyptians had help from extraterrestrials. He said,
Yeah.
it's kind of offensive because we're a brilliant society, and that's who we were. And one day at work, I said to him, I asked him something. I said, "Oh, did you get that item from the desk?" He goes, "Yes, I took one of my 8 arms and I got it." And I was like, "Oh, okay, I get it. I'm sorry, Nader." But we don't realize that, things like that can actually be a bit of a reductive
Well, yeah,
reasoning for
and when you
someone
think
who's,
about it, as if
yeah.
humans couldn't do that, or as if Egyptians
Hmm.
or Africans or whatever couldn't do it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I love that because it makes you look at it. It makes you actually like sort of abandon this idea that there was like a flying spaceship and think about the ingenuity of humanity. Like everything that we've done to this point is from that level of invention, really.
Right, we've stood
So,
on the shoulders of those who went before us.
yeah, that's terrific. And when it comes to sort of like the historical aspect of the real stories that you're telling, and then bringing the ancient history and then bringing the fantasy together, I wonder, how do you sort of balance making it approachable and digestible for readers? Because there's a point where if it's too far one way or the other, you don't know if it's isolating or too deep or too complex. So how do you find that balance?
Yeah, that is a tricky thing, and I guess every author solves it at a different line.
Mm-hmm.
I've tried to be rigorously authentic. If I ever deviate from any known fact, I've let readers know that in my historical preface. But on the other hand, you don't want it to be just clotted with historicity, too many details or forcing stuff down people's throats. And I've read books like that where you just feel like, okay, I know you're learned or you've studied this or whatever. So I want it to be, first of all, a good novel, a good story. And I want the human nature, the characters to be authentic as human beings, first of all, and as Egyptians in a secondary, level.
Mm.
I think if people can identify with the characters as humans and see how much we share with people of any age and any society, that will make it approachable. For example, all the battles and treaties and things we study in history, well, those battles were fought in the midst of real people, and families suffered. They had to flee. Had people killed. It was it was something that we as a race are familiar with today too. So I don't think it should be remote if it's well handled, if it isn't overdone on the authenticity side.
Yeah. And when you just said how, when you're reading a book that seems overly complicated or almost ostentatiously like
Yes,
verbose,
yes.
you're almost saying to the author, like, okay, I get it. You went to Harvard, but can you
Yeah.
bring me into, can you make it easier for me? It's like they're almost like showing off and they're not.
Yeah, exactly. I
Yeah.
have that feeling sometimes.
Interesting. So your background, and well, on that same token, then your background as a teacher and scholar, I imagine that sort of informs almost the way that you write. Do you find that you're sort of like that component of your personality of knowing that you are there to instruct and inform? Is that shaping the way in which you're telling these stories?
I would say so. As a teacher, my goal was always to present in a simple, comprehensible way something that was perhaps complicated. So that's sort of, just as you were saying, is also the goal of a good historical novelist. So I try to take complex political intrigues or what have you and present them in a humanly accessible way. My goal as a novelist is pretty much the same as my goal as a teacher, and that was to make people understand that the people of the past were human beings just like us. I mean, and so comprehensible.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important part too, because we need to always, we kind of talked about it a little earlier, but, just making sure we have that connection to the past,
Yeah.
Much more informed that way and less likely to make mistakes of the past if we are aware.
And if we don't have that human connection, then the past, its history can seem boring, and then we don't pay attention to it. So I think bringing out the human dimension is what makes it gripping and important.
Yeah. When it comes to the career of being an archaeologist, because a lot of our audience, they are college age students, and we have, and it's a wide range of non-traditional students who are older, maybe 40s and 50s. And then, of course, college age. Right. So we're speaking to our demographic there. And then, of course, then we've got the actual, like, sort of traditional college age kids that are 19 to 25-ish. And we don't really I don't think I've ever talked about archaeology as a career here. And the careers that we've discussed. So this is a great opportunity. What would someone do if they're interested in being an archaeologist? Like, what is the first step for them?
Well, to find a program, not every university has a program in archaeology. And I went to the University of Texas when I was young and was beginning to do archaeology down there, but I didn't know what culture I wanted to study. So it was sort of scattershot. Then I left school, and when I went back after the convent, I went to the University of Texas in Arlington, which had no program in archaeology, but they did have a program in classical studies. So I went into that, and there was an archaeologist on the staff, and I studied with general archaeology in the anthropology department. So there are several ways to get into archaeology as a career. And one is through anthropology. It's a branch of anthropology. One would be through classical studies or Near Eastern studies or African studies, depending on what area you want to study. And I would say include languages, ancient languages. It's almost because you really have to understand in depth the culture you're going to be excavating. What else? Study history, study the history of that area. And by the time you've sort of gotten through your undergraduate studies, if you go my route, it was a very mixed preparation. By the time I had my degree and started into graduate school in a classical and Near Eastern archaeology department, I had an extremely good preparation, even though my school was not as prestigious as, say, Harvard or Yale. I had a better preparation for my coursework than a lot of those students because I hadn't specialized. I had gone broad. And so that's just something to keep in mind if you don't have the luxury of going to Harvard or Yale as an undergraduate.
Yeah. Yep. Another great point to make too, because very often we do, well, I don't say we, but I guess society, we get wrapped up in like the name of an
Yeah.
institution on a resume and where you went versus the actual hands-on experience. And I tell friends all the time who are doing like their liberal arts at Columbia. And I'm like, well, algebra is pretty much algebra. So that same
Yeah.
algebra you just paid $100,000 for, I learned for like 8,000 at community college.
Yeah.
So,
Exactly.
so it's sort of one of those things that you really have to specialize your interest and look at the schools that make sense for that
Right.
particular interest, not the school name.
And I can say this too. When I was looking at graduate schools, I happened to have a big scholarship going with me. So a lot of schools made overtures, and one of those was Princeton. And, I went up there on their nickel to look them over, and they didn't have the exact components of the program that I wanted. They weren't deep diving into the geographical regions that I wanted to study. So I preferred to go somewhere else. And
That's fascinating. Wow.
Bryn Mawr College was also very well known for its archaeology department, but they happened to have the exact mix of coursework that I wanted, and Princeton, which was better known, did not. So that's something to keep in mind if when you're thinking about going into it.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. Thank you for sharing that. And then I guess the next component of that question, and I don't mean like to make you into an HR rep right now, but but what are the after that, the jobs that are possible? Do you work for museums potentially, or do you maybe work at a university, or like what are some of the areas where you'd actually work and for your livelihood if you have a degree in that background?
In a degree in archaeology, I don't want to be discouraging, but there aren't many positions. So a lot of my classmates ended up doing other things. One of them, which is archaeological, was to go into state archaeology programs. I know there's one in New Jersey because I used to take my students to their sites where they go in ahead of a road work or something and examine, what shall I say, a colonial site of some sort. And in a Civil War encampment or something like that.
Right.
So every state has a state archaeology department, and that's something they're always looking for, archaeologically trained people to do. Of course, the traditional thing is to go into teaching, university level teaching, but you may not find yourself teaching archaeology. You may be teaching ancient history or ancient languages. So here's where your broad background comes in handy.
Yeah, with like specialty learning and specialty
you can specialize too much. Museum work is also out there. There are quite a number of museums in the country that have classical or Near Eastern collections. So that's one of my classmates is now at the Met in that regard.
Yeah.
So that's something to keep in mind as well. And of course, art history as well as archaeology would help you there. So I would say be ready to jump in a number of directions and don't be too proud to teach high school history or something like that, at least temporarily.
Yeah.
My theory is the earlier you can catch people and infect them with the love of learning and learning history and archaeology, the better. So by the time they're in the university, it may be too late. If you can catch them earlier, that's even better. So that is not a step down in my mind. It's maybe striking where the iron is hottest.
Sure. And again, that's great advice for people who are considering what they want to do in life. I know for me, I thought about it as just a place, if I could work in that field when I was younger, I thought I'd at least at the very minimal be able to see the world and be a part of maybe archaeological digs. And if I wanted to travel, that might be a way to even incorporate that into my life.
And through the American Institute of Archaeology, there are a lot of digs that take volunteers. So you don't even have to be, a professional or student in the profession to take part in those excavations all around the world. They always list a bunch of digs that are looking for volunteers, and it's a wonderful experience.
I had no idea. That's great. Thank you for sharing that as well. Now you've had this, well, we say unconventional path, but I just say it's nonlinear, we'll call it. You had a nonlinear path to where you are today. And so when it comes to people hearing your own story and reading your books as well, but maybe more aligned with your own personal story, what do you hope maybe people would take away from your own journey in general?
Well, one would be, of course, it's never too late to find your niche. I mean, I've had many different jobs, not just the few you enumerated. But as a child, archaeology was my goal, and I got off track, you might say, frequently, in fact. But eventually, I found my way back there, and it was. You're speaking of non-traditional students. I was 40 when I went back to get my BA. So, it's never too late. You just keep that dream burning bright ahead of you.
Wow. Well, we're happy that you found this path to being the fabulous N.L. Holmes that has found her way in these great novels and books. And this has been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate you being here today, sharing your wisdom, your story, your journey with us. And it's just been an absolute honor. N.L. Holmes. Yes. Well, thank you so much. Well, your latest, we'll make sure everyone has links to the books to check out everything. But your most recent one is
the Wheel of Evil, but I have a new one coming out at the end of this month.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's the Melody of Evil.
The Melody of Evil. Yes, yes. We'll make sure that everyone can find that as well once this podcast publishes. And we really appreciate you being here today. N.L. Holmes, prolific novelist with 13 published books and just a wonderful, remarkable life. Thanks for being here today on Motivational Mondays.
Thanks.